talk today is really the lessons that have been learned from the implementation of the QNJAC Isolation Audit Guidance and how it influenced future QNJAC audit guidance. The audit guidance came from an industry initiative. It was the Strategic Forum for the Health and Safety in the mineral products sector. It's a forum that had all the major companies involved, and it was chaired by Lawrence Waterman. The people involved, the participants, were the majors from Tarmac, Cemex, Hanson, AI, Breeden. Also, there was the trade bodies, the BAA and the MPA, and HSC, unions, QNJAC, and the various academic establishments as well. So it's a very eclectic group, and really what it was for, it was to try and get a coordination across the industry on the real key topics that were actually hurting people in our industry. We'd come to a level where we were looking at a platform that our performance had really plateaued out, and we were still hurting and killing people. So we chose the topic of isolation as really the first main topic, because this is the entrapment is one of the real key areas that we were finding as an industry that we were hurting and killing people. And really, there was no reason in the world why this should happen, because there was the opportunity to isolate. So out of the strategic forum came three sort of main outputs. One was the MPA Guide to Isolation booklet, which I hope that everybody's certainly seen a copy of that, and it's been shared extensively throughout the industry and by the Quarry Management Journal. There's also a 2-day training course and e-learning package that was produced from the MPQC. And then there was the QNJAC had the responsibility for producing a site workplace audit. So you could check that you were fit to isolate on the site, and outlining the performance standards for the people in the plant. So it was reinforcing the plan, do, check part of the isolation. The real key part about this is the audit is something that when an inspector goes on site, or if there's an incident on site, or there's just a routine inspection, they'll be coming to look for this audit, because it shows that whatever the size of the operation is, or whoever the operating company is that you've sat down and looked at how you actually want to perform your isolations on site. So really is that it is the must-have at hand document. It's a document that the people on the site need to understand, and they need to be involved in the audit. The audit was produced through a working group which had all the main key expertise in this area from the different companies, and it was that I chaired, and it involved the HSC. This is one of the great things about any of the QNJAC guidance, is that it is actually produced with the HSC and signed off by the HSC. So you can have industry guidance, but really the one that actually has got the HSC approval is the QNJAC guidance. So if you're not well informed with QNJAC guidance, because it's on many different parts of the quarrying operations, whether it's geotechnical, it is a website that you really need to go on, because there's some fantastic guidance there, and it's been produced by the experts in the industry. So if I move on, I'll pass over to Andy to take you through what the audit composes of and how it was put together.
Thanks, Viv. Good afternoon, everybody. As I was previously introduced, my name's Andy Meadows. I think I've seen one or two faces on the people on this presentation, so it's nice to see a few familiar faces, certainly that I've worked with before over previous years. So I'm going to talk you through site energy isolation self-audit, which will explain hopefully some of the salient points, and also probably recount some of the challenges that we've had with implementation, and to just explain how we've managed to actually do the audit ourselves. So firstly, just as an introduction, the document covers all aspects of the isolation process. For example, suitable means to isolate equipment, training, assessment, supervision and audit. We've removed the section that is involved with track key systems because, having spoken to the HSE about this, it's not really an isolation subject. It's more to do with safety control systems, and where it is sometimes used for isolation, then it can be quite complex. So in the near future, I'm going to chair a committee of industry experts to come up with some guidance on track key systems and also safety, what we call safety control systems. So if you have any questions on track key systems that you have at the moment, then you should really advice from competent electrical engineers on that matter, and it's not obviously part of this audit. So the scope, it covers all industries related to our sector. It is heavily biased towards electrical isolation because that's the main motive power to most machinery, which causes harm. And the audit should be carefully planned. It's not designed to be a desktop audit. It's more designed to be going out on site, having a look at what you've got and addressing any of the challenges that you find. There's also some useful references in the guidance that you can use to assist you. So the audit itself, the first section is facilities and equipment. So what do you have on your site for isolation? Part 2 covers process, which is about your procedures. Part 3 is about people, which includes training and appointments. Part 4 is measuring that performance, so active and reactive monitoring. And 5 is auditing by management and senior management of the whole system. So a couple of photographs of facilities and equipment. So question 1 is, are there clearly marked isolating devices for machinery, plant and equipment, and can they be cross-referenced to the plant, machine and equipment? So it's quite a straightforward one. You do see on the vast majority of occasions that equipment isolators are clearly marked and marked to the equipment that it clearly isolates. Second question is, has suitably qualified electricians or electrical engineers confirmed that electrical isolation devices cut off the energy supply and not the control circuit? So as you can see from that photograph next to the isolator, this was actually a good idea, which turned out to be possibly not a good idea, if you see what I mean. You can see the multi-hasp underneath that control box. Originally, the site decided that if they go inside that machine, and you can see the 2 blue blocks there, they're a safety control system, and they're what's called a coded magnet system. If anybody went inside that machine, then to prevent somebody shutting the door and pressing the reset button behind them, they placed a multi-hasp on the door lock and put their padlocks on it, which was actually a very good idea. But what ended up happening was that people were using that multi-hasp and their locks for isolation. So clearly that safety device is not an isolation device. So you need to be very clear that before entering machinery, that it is clearly isolated and the devices that are using clearly isolate the motive power and not the control circuit. So they're the sort of things that need to be checked on the audit. And that's one of the reasons sometimes we've not included the track key systems in this, because people have sometimes used track key systems which are connected to control circuits and not physically connected to isolators, and use them for isolation of machinery. So is it possible to isolate all forms of stored energy? So on the left is a standard electrical isolator. I don't know if everybody's familiar with what's above that isolator, but that's called a REM live. So we use them to aid isolation, and under normal circumstances when the power is on, there's 3 little neon indicators to tell you that all 3 of the phases are live. And then when you operate the isolator, all 3 of those neons go out, which helps to prove that the panel is dead. On the right is a compressed air isolation device, standard ball valve. That's what on one of our sites. We normally isolate those and lock them off with a device for isolating the air, and then obviously dissipate the air as part of that process. Do you have sufficient equipment for isolation hazardous energy? and do you prohibit master or duplicate keys? So as a site, as a business, you need to make sure you have sufficient locks, sufficient hasps, and sufficient equipment to isolate all forms of energy on site. We've put in there about prohibiting master and duplicate keys. That's something that not common practice a number of years ago, but I've seen it before, where duplicate keys are kept in a key safe in case anybody loses the key. But we absolutely prohibit the use of master or duplicate keys for isolation locks. Ensuring isolators cannot be locked in the on position. So on the left-hand photograph, that is an isolator that I took a photograph of that a number of years ago, and you'll see the writing MEM on those, on the isolator, and that's typical of an MEM isolator that was 30, 40 years old. You could actually lock them in the on and off position. And that was actually an incident that I investigated on a robot cell where two fitters had been working on a robot, and they'd been isolating that device on and off for several times during the day. On one occasion, they actually isolated it in the on position and went into the robot cell. Fortunately, the robot didn't start up, but the manager went into the factory and saw that it was isolated in the on position. And we got rid of all of those isolators as part of a company policy. I've not seen any of them, those types of isolators, for quite a number of years, but you need to make sure that you can't lock them in the on position. There may be one or two still knocking about in your business. The middle photograph is of some high voltage equipment where you normally lock that in the on position because you don't want anybody unauthorised operating high voltage switchgear. Because if you don't know the history of switchgear, if it could be oil filled, it could be anything, if it's got no maintenance history, and you try and turn high voltage switchgear on and off, it could cause an explosion. So we normally lock those in the on position. And then the right hand photograph is a standard isolator that you see mostly on plant and on sites now for local isolation of machinery and equipment. So the process: do isolation procedures clearly identify all points of isolation? Do they ensure machinery cannot be operated? Do they cover all types of equipment, plant and machinery? Do they take into account all of the tasks and all forms of hazardous energy? And do they consider automated machinery? At Longcliffe quarries, and you probably have these in your businesses as well, but we introduced an isolation certificate. When I first came to Longcliffe, we didn't have this type of document. So we introduced this, and we also introduced isolation controllers. And the isolation controller, under certain circumstances, will fill in one of these certificates and put in the type of hazardous energy, the location of the isolation points, the type of energy, and the persons involved in the isolation, and then sign that and print his name. When it's being cleared, there's a clear and cancellation section, and there's also a transfer of duties section in there. So if an isolation goes over more than one shift, then let's say the day shift can hand the isolation over to the afternoon shift isolation controller, and then the isolation controller will clear the afternoon shift. Will clear that isolation certificate once the work's been completed and everything's safe to run. So I think I've seen these many times. I've seen different variations of them. From my experience, the isolation controller for complicated isolation events or contractor isolation events is one of the most important things that we've implemented over the last few years, because somebody in supervisory or management level is in control of that isolation. And I think that is absolutely vital if you're going to get your isolation correct. I've got a bit of call it a war story that we've recently encountered with isolation. We had an issue with a plant where we had a burner controller failure, and the company came out to reprogram the controller together with one of our control system guys, and he reprogrammed it, and he had to test the burner system and the dryer, which required him to start a couple of fans up. One was a blowing fan, the other was an exhaust fan. And right at the top of the plant, it's quite complicated with different takeoffs of ducting and fans and so on and so forth, because we make different sizes of materials. And whilst they were trying to commission the controller, we had two fitters had already started to change some V-belts on another fan. But they'd fully isolated that fan. And fortunately, they weren't in the process of changing the V-belts. But as they started up the plant, one of the fitters noticed that the pulley on the fan had started to turn very slowly. So anyway, they stopped the job, went downstairs, spoke to the engineering supervisor, spoke to the production supervisor. And then they realised that because they'd started the burner up, it had affected the airflows around the whole plant. And there was that much suction from the main fan that it had started to turn the fan that these guys were working on. So we've just done an investigation into it, and the outcome will be partly about isolating the whole plant when we're doing maintenance, and obviously if we're doing any reactive work, preventing any maintenance activities happening on that plant, so that one activity cannot happen if there's another activity going on. So that's been a big learn, and then we've had a lot of opportunities to learn from that as well. It was one that has caught us out, and that the guys have obviously taken a lot of learns from that. Process again, our risk assessments are reviewed for isolation. The systems ensure it's not possible to enter a live area from an isolated area, and do procedures cover more complex isolations, for example, multiple points of isolation, multiple types of hazardous energy, and extended shifts isolation. So obviously the war story I just gave you about the fans, there were the learns about multiple types of hazardous energy there and multiple points of isolation. The photograph on the left is about entering live areas from an isolated area. As you can see, that's at a precast factory, and those, if you can see that sort of inverted T-shape, yellow pieces of equipment there on the right are light curtains. And those light curtains should be used for preventing people going into a machine, and they're part of a safety control circuit. And what those light curtains were being used for was to detect that material and that pallet on that conveyor. And you could make a mistake thinking that was a safety device, because that's what it's designed to do. But actually it wasn't being used as a safety device at the time. So you need to ensure that if you're using safety devices, you use them as safety devices and not as a product detection device. One of the biggest questions I ever get asked is test and try, because it can be quite a complex and complicated subject. But I'll just explain that this is how we do it at Longcliffe Quarries. You'll have different methods. There'll be certainly different ways of doing it throughout any business, but this is just the way that we do it. So we have a touch screen on each one of the control panels. So you're then able to put a device into manual, because we have some complicated plant. And the right-hand picture is the SCADA system, and that's the alarm page. And you couldn't start any parts of the plant in manual. You had to start them up in sequence. Some SCADA systems will have a manual page, so you can start things in manual. But we decided to go down the route of a separate screen in the motor control center room. So you would stop the sequence, you would put the sequence into manual. You would then go to the device and put the device, and start and stop the device from that HMI screen. So when you do that and do the test and try, then you get an alarm comes up on the page, on the alarms on the SCADA saying Ambuco, BC5 tested in manual and sequence in manual. And for test and try purposes, the only real way of doing it is to run the piece of equipment, isolate it, and then run it again. So at least you know it's ran, you've isolated it, and then you know it hasn't run. Now, there will be occasions where a motor will have gone down or a gearbox will have gone down and you can't run it. So if you have instances like that, then we have to get the equipment tested by an electrician to prove it's dead. But on most occasions where we're doing mechanical maintenance work, we'll do a test and try using those touch screens in the switch room. So do your procedures include for authorised persons to ensure equipment is safe to re-energise, and do you have formal procedures to ensure that the equipment has been returned to a safe condition before the isolation is removed? Are there robust handover procedures in place for shift changeover to ensure the isolation remains effective during the handover? So that's where we use the isolation certificates for that. So the next one's people. Is there a system to develop and maintain the competencies for isolation work? This should include identifying training needs for managers, supervisors, people carrying out risk assessments, employees and contractors. Is the standard of training adequate? Do you verify the competence? So is it external or internal, or do you go on qualifications as well? Records should also be kept on site of competent and authorised persons. So the way we go about it at Longcliffe is when we authorise isolation controllers, they have to go on an external training course. We used, many of you will know, a guy called Rob Shaw from Safety Coaching. So we employed Rob Shaw to carry out that training. And then from that, we selected a number of people. We didn't select everybody. We selected a number of people to be isolation controllers. And then we formally authorised them in writing. What we also do, before I go on to this next slide, is that if you're not an isolation controller, you're still authorised in writing to fit an isolation lock or to carry out an isolation for yourself. And that is internal training that I carry out with the guys, which is a toolbox talk, video, and then a question and answer set. And then we basically we authorise them with the locks, with a multi-hasp, and we authorise them to self-isolate and to fit a padlock, basically. So measuring performance. Do you have performance standards for isolations, and are they monitored? So setting the requirements for effective isolation and monitoring its performance. Active monitoring is required for isolation standards and tasks, which should include supervision of isolation tasks. That's where we use the isolation controllers for that. Compliance with your own training, instructions and procedures. Inspections of the tasks being performed and once completed. Auditing of the monitoring process itself. Number 3 is reactive monitoring is also required, which should include incident and near-miss reporting, instant investigation, and communication across the business to ensure learns are implemented. Is there an effective audit process in place? And the findings of audits need to be communicated to senior management. And senior management should take an active role in reviewing the overall isolation system against policies and feed this back to the sites. And consideration must be given to relative industry isolation incidents and the impacts these have on your business. So, for instance, the one that I talked about the fans, we're looking at putting out an alert on that to say, look, this is what we've discovered, and these are the learns that we've gained from that incident. And finally, the audit should be taken as a positive step forward, eliminating injuries and death from hazardous energy sources. Gaps found in the audit process should not be taken as negative results, but learns that can be taken to improve. If you have any doubt or concerns, you should consult with health and safety professionals or competent persons such as electrical and mechanical engineers. Okay, that's the end of the presentation, guys. So if anybody has or there are any questions, please feel free to ask either myself or Viv.
I think the important bit we just found about the audit process, there's a lot of learns that came through while we did the audit. It's a very, very powerful tool when you sit down with your team and it goes through the breakup of how you isolate on site. But also one of the very important things to remember from a young manager's point of view is that this is what the inspectors are going to be looking for. If you have an incident or something, they'll be looking at, have you completed this audit? And the audit is there to help you. It's to take the learns from it. It may give you opportunities for getting capital. It may give you opportunities for making time for training people. But it is there as a very positive part of the process. But there are certainly some learns we've taken, and please take the opportunity to quiz myself and Andy about it.
So Andy, in practice, how have you managed to do the test and try? Because that's always a difficult one, I found.
Yeah, as I said, Steve, we didn't really have anything in place at all. So, and with using those touchscreens, that's the way I've done it before. So basically, you have your standard SCADA control system, and then you have another system which is within the switch room that takes control of the plant, which allows you to put something into manual. So, for instance, if we were changing a scraper on a conveyor, for instance, then the guys would go in the switch room, put that conveyor into manual, they would run it, they would then isolate it, and then they would try and run it again. And then that would be the way that we do our test and try. I've seen it done with push buttons on a panel, but the thing you find is with most modern systems that get installed these days, that panels are just a door in front of all the switch gear that's behind it, and you only have either a PC controlling the plant or a touchscreen controlling the plant, and you need to make sure that you build in a test and try facility certainly on new installations, but then look at retrofitting something on older installations, because most installations will have a programmable logic controller to control the plant. If not, then you've got to do it with manual buttons, or you've got to do it with an engineer proving dead, an electrician proving dead. There's no real other way of doing it. It is very, very difficult to sometimes implement.
Yes, it's very difficult with some of the older plants we've got, and when we down, out to some of the bigger quarries, we haven't got electricians on site, and some of the concrete plants and stuff.
Yeah.
That's that. We do perhaps over reliant on people to do some of this as well. Is my concern.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, most of the older plants that I've seen, they were always built with local stop starts on the panel doors, which you could put them into manual and press a start button, or that's how you ran the plant. Sometimes you may have to run the sequence and then see that run in sequence, and then stop it in sequence and try it again. But that can have its issues, because it might not be isolation that has prevented it from running if you try to run it in sequence. So I'm not saying it's straightforward, Steve, but there's always a way round things. It sometimes takes a bit of investment and thought on how to do it. Yeah. But there'll always be a way. There will be a way around it. Some of our plants are 40 plus years old, and we had to put some PLCs in. We had to, with these touchscreens, just to do what we wanted to do, really.
I think one of the interesting things that came out of it, Steve, was when we went through the process of producing the audit, was the importance of the hierarchy of isolation. The old days of the manager shutting down the main incoming feed and putting a padlock in it and putting the key in his pocket is actually one of the most successful ways of making sure you isolate and test and try.
Yep.
We've overcomplicated it, and that's why we've hurt so many people. It's actually the hierarchy. If you can turn the plant off, that is the best way to isolate, without a doubt.
Yep.
I think you'd say that at the same as
well.
Yeah,
I would. Yeah. I definitely. If you've got the opportunity to do that, then if it's an asphalt plant, a concrete plant, then you have got a good opportunity to isolate the plant as a whole and switch the main panel off. I think one of the things that we did find, though, whilst discussing the document, was some people were isolating circuit breakers in the substation, which if you can avoid that, then you need to be isolating the control panel. So at the motor control centre, if you have that. Obviously, if not, then you've got to go back back a stage and isolate a circuit breaker. But sometimes you do find that certain switch fuses, circuit breakers that are in distribution boards are difficult to fit a lock to. You might be able to turn them, switch them off, but you might have to make a device to actually isolate it. So there'll always be an isolation point for a plant or a piece of kit.
Thank you.
Can I just come in? I've got just a couple of things to just pick up from people who are interacting through the chat, which is great. One, I don't know if it's Viv or Andy to answer, but if you got any more details on how to get access to the MPQC e-learning course, do you know specifically where to find more details on that?
The best place is contact MPQC direct. Or even drop me a note and I'll get John from the MPQC to contact you about it. That's where the MPQC direct will be able to give you information on that.
Perfect, thank you. And I've got a very patient raised hand sitting in the corner here. So Steve Cole, do you want to ask your question or come in?
Have you had any feedback from HSE in terms of the take-up of this? Is it been right the way through small companies to larger companies? And perhaps with COVID coming in, it's screwed everything up a bit. But the driver for it was saving injuries, saving lives. Is there any statistical information yet, or is it too early to say?
On the first question, Steve, that the initial take-up from the HSE was that there was evidence when they were going out to see that the questionnaire had been started, and people were working through it, and actually there'd been references from companies to the HSE on some areas of clarification on it. But I think COVID got in the way a little bit from it. Statistically, I wouldn't know. Certainly, as an industry, we haven't heard of any major fatalities from it. But I think that the important bit is that we'll go back and review that. But the next similar audit we will be doing as part of QNJAC will be on the interaction between mobile plant and pedestrians. The hit by moving vehicle side of it. But certainly this audit is here to stay and will be the benchmark that anybody will be, if they want to understand how equipped they are for their isolation, that's what it'll be. I think the follow-up will come. I know that because Colin Mew was involved. He was on the task. He was on the task and finish group, and I know it was one of the key topics that the agency have got targeted.
Another quick one. Could either Viv or Andy just remind people where they can find the checklist for the audit itself if they haven't had a chance to look at that documentation yet?
Do you want this one, Andy?
Yes, it's on the QNJAC website. So all of the QNJAC documents are on there. So fairly straightforward to download and use and fill in. So that's where normally quite easy to find.
Perfect.
How long did it take you from start to finish, Andy, to do it?
To do it. I think what we did to start with, I know we said, obviously it says it's not a desktop exercise, but what we did to start with was actually a desktop exercise, which then drove us to go, we're not as good as we think we are at this, which then drove us to go and go out and look at what we got on sites and implement it. I would say, in all honesty, we implemented, we did the training with the guys, we implemented the isolation controller and the forms and the test and try stuff. We've still got a bit of work to do, to be honest, to actually now audit every single plant to ensure that we are actually compliant with the document, because we've got a hell of a lot of equipment on the plants that we've got, and we've done, I think we've done 2 plants so far, and there's quite a lot of information, so photographs, so on and so forth, that you take, and then operating procedures for isolation of plants. So I would say to do the initial audit took us, I would say probably 3 months to get the bare bones together and then start to implement it, and probably a further 6 months to do what we've done so far. But it's an ongoing process, to be fair, because you still got to go out there and audit isolation events. You've still got to audit what isolation events you've done, and then you've got to do your interactive audits. But I would say somewhere between 3 and 9 months, depending on the size of the plant and the size of the site. Really, it does, and it throws up some challenges as well, because you might think you're getting it right, but there'll be parts of it that open your eyes. You think, actually, we haven't got that quite right. But it's certainly it's an easy process to follow.
Right, we've got a couple of people patiently waiting with their hands up. So if we go to Gary McNeely first, and then to Barry John.
Hi, Andy. Great presentation. Thanks, guys. In the QNJAC audit was heavily, you said heavily electrical based. Is there a reason why it's heavily electrical based? Is it driven more by statistics and incidents that's across the industry, or just the obvious reason we have a lot of electrical equipment?
I think it's because the vast majority of equipment, Gary, has an electrical. Electrical is the motive power. It's really where we concentrated the area on. And if you look at the vast majority of incidents, it's mainly because the electrical motive power has not been isolated correctly, and the machine started up because it hasn't been electrically isolated. So I think that's why it was weighted towards that. And it's quite easy to as I think, as Viv alluded to, that if you knock the plant off at the main isolator, you've isolated the plant. But I think one of the biggest things that we have discovered certainly is stored energy. Yeah. It's extremely important a part of isolation as well. Because you've got to make sure that you've got that bit right, because when you've got something isolated working on it, something could move. Because you've got that stored energy. So the electrical side of it was seen as the biggest hazard, really.
Oh, cool. Thanks for that.
Go to Barry John, please.
Good afternoon, all. Firstly, thanks, Andy and Viv, for the presentation. Well done, guys. The question relates to the isolation owner or controller external training that you had done, Andy.
Yeah.
That's something that you could sort of share details of where you undertook that, what company helped you out with that, etc.
Yeah, that was, we used, you've probably heard of Rob Shaw. He's been sort of in the industry for quite a number of years and been a health and safety professional, and now he's got his own business doing helping with health and safety and training. So we used Rob, and his company's called Safety Coaching. I think it's actually on the presentation, Barry, that you'll see his details on there. But he basically made it bespoke to our business, so he could do that for any business really. And probably one of the main reasons we use Rob is because he's very practicable, and because he understands the industry so well, he can actually talk right down at shop floor level, and get his point of view across quite well to everybody within the audience. So we had a range of people on the training, right from managers down to from fitters, electricians to actually plant operators. But the way he delivers his training, everybody understands, and it is quite practical as well. So he'll bring in isolation devices, and then he'll go out and plant and look at the plant itself, and so on and so forth. So everybody who actually did that training with Rob enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. But there are other companies that are out there who obviously do that sort of training. It's just, I think we've used Robin for a number of years, and we trusted what he did for us, really.
Yeah, and was that sort of a half-day sort of tuition? Or
no, I think it was a full day.
Full day, yeah.
Full day's training, yeah. There was a classroom, and then there was a written examination on it, and then obviously out on site as well. Yeah, and we decided to do that because the isolation controllers need to be externally verified, really. I could have delivered the training myself, but we didn't want to do it internally only.
Yeah, sure, I understand that.
Right, we're going to go to, I feel like I'm in the Eurovision Song Contest here now. We're going to go to Rod Nudgel to see what his question is, followed by Matthew Bishop.
Yeah, right, thanks, Sarah. I've lost my other screen, so I can't see whether can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, good, okay. Viv, you're probably better, because you mentioned that there were a lot of learns that you've already got from this process. Now, Andy sort of alluded to some of them, but I was just wondering, were there any common gaps that you found in your procedures? And if there were, how are you going to then put those into your updated audit guidance? Because you mentioned obviously you'll be moving on from this to update for the future.
I think the big learns we took, first of all, that it's not a desktop exercise.
Yeah.
that was the biggest learn that we had, and even though we knew that, we sat down and actually treated it like a desktop.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, did it and proved it. Yeah.
And but the biggest thing was engagement. You have to get everybody on the site engaged in it. And it's funny because you sat down especially me being a non-electrician with all these eminent electricians and what struck me very quickly, it was nothing to do with electricity. It was all about change management. It's and actually how do we actually communicate this across to people, and that's really where the audit came out. And I don't think that the audit will change very little, Rod, because it is, when you look at it, it's fairly simple and fairly practical. Mm-hmm. It's the implementation is the important bit.
Yeah, the application, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Matthew Bishop.
It was more feedback than anything. We've begun the QNJAC isolation audits within our business, and we've got a list as long as your arm of things that we've identified that we need to improve on. We began by using by making sure that everybody had a knowledge of the principles, and I just wondered if there was going to be a link up with the MPA on their guide to energy isolation and LOTOTO. We used that, going back to a point where most of the people on this call will no doubt have isolation experience and knowledge that goes over many years. But for the people that are new to this, for the youngsters in the game, our starting point was to give them the underpinning knowledge on the MPA documentation to start with. and us old croakers in the business are now using the QNJAC audit as our tool to help educate the younger people as well.
Yeah, they're all part of a sort of the three-pronged attack. Actually, the MPA booklet was obviously the one that came out first, and it fits in with the audit. And I think it's a very good, useful point for people, because you've got to carry on isolating, after you've done the audit, before you've done the audit, and then after you've done the audit. So, and that's with the MPQC learning as well. So they're all, and that's what we're trying to do with the Strategic Forum, is to try and get an industry approach. So it's the MPA, the QNJAC audit, the guidance. QNJAC is there for guidance, and that's the how it's done is very much out to trade associations, businesses, and things like that. So it does sit at a guidance level, and with the MPA, the MPA book to help you how you'd implement it.
Another learn I think we took from this, Matt, was you've got to have people on site who know how the process works, as in the production process.
Yeah,
and teaching them that as part of the isolation process was vital for them to understand how to isolate machinery, how to and plant, especially if it's complicated, such as ours, where we're powders processing business, where we've got all sorts of machinery, all interlinked, all sorts of sequences, and getting people to understand how that process works is a vital part of them getting to understand how isolation works as well. I think that was a one thing that we did find.
We had an incident a week or two ago on site. Nobody hurt or anything like that, but it was where an isolator failed. The little pull-out tab that you drop the handle, and there's a little black plastic thing that comes out.
Yeah.
Well, that actually partially broke away when an additional person came to apply his lock. Everybody there was guys out doing maintenance, and this isolator had failed on him, and he wasn't sure what to do in that situation. Fair play to him, straight on the radio, got the electrician to have a look, and it was isolated. Pull all the guys off the job and isolate it downstream further. Until we could get that isolator changed. But it concerns me the younger generations don't necessarily have that knowledge at this present moment. I mean, it's a difficult one.
I think it's also quite key to on electrical inspections, where we've introduced a system where isolators are checked and tested and so on and so forth. And both me and yourself are XAI people, Matt, and we sort of implemented that a number of years ago. But you do still find that isolators are they're used a hell of a lot. But if you're not checking and inspecting them, then sometimes they'll fail because of the nature where they're installed, and B, sometimes with when you buy these bits of equipment, isolators are not up to the duty that they're required in. But I think it is having those procedures to say, right, if something doesn't work, what do you do? And I think that's a constant learning process for all of us. Is right, we've had an incident. What are we doing? What are we going to do to prevent that happening again? We've had numerous isolators fail on site because they've been used that many times, and we've decided here to say, right, okay, we're not going to use that type of isolator again, and we're going to beef them up, make them better, and so on and so forth. But it is a difficult one where you've got young people coming into the industry. It's giving them that level of training, isn't it, to understand what they need to do when it goes wrong. I think the good thing is when people stop and go, there's something gone wrong here. Like we had with the incident with the fans, you know, maybe a few years ago, nothing would have been said about that. But we've now had a person go, oh, something's gone wrong here. I'm going to report it. And we give those people a value reward for that, for actually identifying issues and problems, and we put them right. Because that could have happened. That may have happened 20 years ago, and nobody would have said anything at that time.
I think that the QNJAC audit was particularly. Sorry for going on a bit, by the way. The QNJAC audit, so long as each question, you don't just brush it aside and go, yeah, we've got that.
Yeah.
And actually take real time to think about what is your answer for this, because we like I said, we have a list as long as your arm now of things that aren't quite right with how we do stuff, and we're just working through that process now. And you have to bare your bones or bare your soul to yourself, don't you?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir.
I think that I agree with you there, Matt, that that's why you've got to get everybody engaged.
Yeah.
And also it's push upwards as well. Your bosses, this is QNJAC, it's adopted by the HSE. You know, they've got to recognise that this is what they're going to get judged on. And to be truthful, their bosses were actually in the safety forum in the first place.
Yeah.
So, I think from my days as being a young quarry manager, you've got to use some of this as leverage to make the improvements. And it's also, from the other side, it's fantastic opportunity, because what it has realised is that your plant isn't up to the level it should be necessarily up to the level, and you're reducing the opportunity to hurt somebody, aren't you?
Any further questions, Sarah? Has anybody else got their hand up? Can't see anybody.
I think that's it now, Steve. I think it's over to you to potentially close the meeting then.
Well, thank you everybody for taking the time out this afternoon. I found it very good, in fact, and very pleasing that we can still do these kind of things during what's going on in the world. Viv, Andy, very informative presentation by two very professionals. It's very obvious that you are excellent experience in your fields. From the presentation and what's been spoken, it's good to see industry-based working groups producing something that's going to be very useful in the field for all aggregate businesses. And then having it signed off by the HSE, we should all be on a level playing field when we're audited. Still disappointing to see lots of isolation issues within the industries, and we all know we've had some fatalities over the last 4 or 5 years with isolations. Many of these are covered, and Andy, thank you for sharing your experiences. And I for one can say, we had an isolation issue at Tor yesterday, which is still under investigation. So we're still having them; they're still happening. So. Presentation, very good reminder, refresher for us all. There's lots for us to review. Pointed out early in the presentation, the stored energies outside electrical stuff. We quite often forget about the other bits of stored energies. I don't think the incidents Andy spoke about are any different to what we say, Ian. So I'd like to thank Viv and Andy for sharing the presentation and their experience and I think we've all got lots of work with developing this audit and running it, sharing it out through our businesses. So I'll thank you on behalf of the West of England branch and all members of the IOQ. I'd also like to thank Sarah and Dave for facilitating today. Without them, I'm sure we wouldn't have had a clear view. So thank you for both of you. Have a pleasant evening and keep safe and look after your families. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, guys.
Yes.
Cheers. Bye-bye.